So let us begin anyway. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and welcome. My name is Mark Mamagonian. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs for the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, NAASR. And on behalf of NAASR and the co-sponsor of today's program, the Society for Armenian Studies, SAS, I want to thank you for being with us. And I, of course, thank the SAS and its president, Barlo Dermurgadichian, for their continuing collaboration. Today's webinar is presented as part of the NAASR Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation lecture series on contemporary Armenian issues. And of course, we thank the Gulbenkian Foundation for their continuing support. And this is certainly a contemporary issue. Let me very briefly remind everyone that both NAASR and SAS are two of the leading organizations that focus on the advancement of Armenian studies, and both depend on membership dues and donations to allow us to do our work. So please, if you are not yet, join and contribute and support these organizations as they do their valuable work. I'm not going to make any announcements of upcoming events because there are too many and we have too much to say today. We have an excellent panel of scholars with us who have come together quickly for this program, and I want to thank them. And in lieu of the lengthy introductions that each deserves, I simply want to tell you who they are. Dr. Bedros Dermatosian, Professor of History, and Hyman Rosenberg, Professor in Judaic Studies, University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Dr. Armen Marsubian, Professor of Philosophy, Southern Connecticut State University. Dr. Elise Semerjian, Robert Aram and Marian Caloustian, and Stephen and Marian Mugar, Chair of Armenian Genocide Studies, Clark University. Dr. Keith David Wattenpaugh, Professor of Human Rights Studies, University of California, Davis. Thanks, folks. Let me now give a very brief narrative for those who are new to the topic, perhaps, and I believe and hope accurate narrative of how we came to be here today. On February 10th, 2026, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and his wife made an official visit to Yerevan, including the Armenian Genocide Museum-Institute and Genocide Memorial Complex at Tsitsanakaberd. It is worth noting, by the way, that he was the highest-ranking American official ever to visit Armenia. Shortly thereafter, Vice President Vance posted a tweet stating that he and Mrs. Vance, quote, attended a wreath-laying ceremony at the Armenian Genocide Memorial to honor victims of the 1915 Armenian Genocide, unquote, which was a little later deleted and replaced with another post avoiding the objectionable word, which I don't believe I need to spell out for you. Vance traveled from Yerevan to Baku, where I don't believe he laid any wreaths, but he did sign a U.S.-Azerbaijani charter on strategic partnership. This isn't the day for an in-depth analysis of Vance's visit to Baku and its significance, but that's another interesting subject. 1 month passed. On March 11th, the director of the AGMI, Dr. Edita Gzoyan, was compelled to resign following the demand from Prime Minister Pashinyan, who stated that, quote, translated, I was the one who asked the director of the Armenian Genocide Museum-Institute to submit a resignation letter. It was done on my instruction. I considered giving a book about Artsakh to Vance to be a provocative act that goes against the government's policy, unquote. Several AGMI board members, including its chair, Raymond Kevorkian, former director Harutian Marutian, and Haranush Karatian, Stefan Asturian, perhaps others, I'm not sure, resigned. The following day, it was announced that Horatia Tashjian, the former head of the Foreign Relations Department at the Prime Minister's office, was named acting director. None of this is reflected on the AGMI website, by the way, at least as of yesterday when I last looked at it. All the clocks appear to have stopped on the day of Vice President Vance's visit. That is reported, and nothing has happened since then, sort of like at Miss Havisham's house in Great Expectations. And so here we are. We're going to proceed through some discussion points and questions, and we'll then open up for questions from the audience. Again, please use the Zoom Q&A. And we're going to try to stay focused on the issues delineated in the flyer that we distributed for this event, which were as follows. In what ways might Gzoyan's actions be seen as contrary to Armenian foreign policy? What dangers are posed for institutions tasked with documenting, memorializing, and informing about Armenia's history and culture if certain topics are deemed off limits? How did Vice President Vance's posting and then deleting a statement about the Armenian genocide factor into this situation? And to what extent is the price of peace to be paid by academic institutions? So let's start where we begin here. Is it reasonable to expect that an entity like the AGMI can function free of political interference or political pressures? In fact, is it unfair to criticize Pashinyan for wanting the AGMI to reflect his government's positions? In other words, is our entire discussion an unreasonable one? Bedros.
Uh, I think any academic institution should function autonomously and should be free in conducting their research. And otherwise, that institution would be under the sponsor, no, it is under the sponsorship of the government, but would be touting the government line. And we see this happening in authoritarian countries or semi-democratic or illiberal democracies. So the government might say that please do not pursue X research and pursue Y research. So it would put the whole venture of academic integrity into question. And that's why I think that the academic institution should act separately in pursuing their own research agenda and not allying themselves or not be under any government surveillance.
Thank you. Bedros. Armen, please unmute.
I agree with Bedros, and I think the danger here is a creeping danger because in countries like Armenia, so much of the institutional uh, structures of academia are state institutions. So if we do this at the Armenian Genocide Memorial Museum-Institute, the next step is a kind of creeping censorship of what can take place at the state universities, because in Armenia, almost all of academia, except for a few French and the American universities, are state-funded institutions, and that's true. We see this, as Bedros said, is this destruction of institutions is central component of rising authoritarianism. We have it in the United States. I mean, the denying the facts is the precursor of losing one's freedom. I'm paraphrasing Timothy Snyder here, and I think that the facts of what was presented to J.D. Vance wasn't about contemporary issues in the conflict in with Azerbaijan. It was my understanding a book, a historical account of how U.S. newspapers had had reported on the conflict in the Caucasus in 1919 to 1923. So, how this is an example of interference with the foreign policy of the Pashinyan administration is a real stretch, I think. This is in a way, because it was J.D. Vance being there, he would be the prime candidate for receiving a book about how the United States viewed the Caucasus 100 years ago. It wasn't as if he was given some political document by the director of the.
Thank you, Armen. Yeah, it's interesting to note that about 2 months before the visit of Vice President Vance, there was an official military delegation that visited, American military delegation that visited the AGMI, led by a brigadier general. And if you read the account on the AGMI website of the visit of the Brigadier General and the visit of Vice President Vance, they are 90% identical in the language of description. The same tour, the same points made, and the same exchange of materials, perhaps not the exact same books, I'm not sure, but described in similar terms. That appeared to occasion no comment or action, whereas obviously the visit of Vice President Vance and the aftermath did.
Should we mention what the book was? That it was Ara Khatibian's Azeri Aggression Against Armenians in Transcaucasia from 1905 to 1921, just to kind of put a punctuation like on what Armin has said, which is that this is a book about affairs from the perspective of the U.S. press, published by AGMI, correct? So it, oh no, it's not published by AGMI? Okay. But it was about the U.S. press, and so it's really documentary in nature, 100 years old. So I think that kind of emphasizes the point that everyone has made already, that this is history. And to answer your question, I would also say if it's an authoritarian state, then it makes absolute sense to terminate an academic who doesn't follow a state narrative of history. And I would also make a distinction between receiving state funding and being a state outlet. If the AGMI is a state outlet, then it's an extension of the Ministry of Propaganda in an authoritarian state structure. So, I think the presumption is that it's an academic institution, and that means there would be critical work done there. And my final point would be that Edita herself has said that her position, from her understanding and from others who are helping her with her case, is not a government appointment. It was an appointment as a researcher.
Thank you. Do we all agree, however reluctantly, that if she had openly criticized the policy of the Pashinyan administration during this visit, or handed out anti-government tracts, that the termination would be justifiable, however much we might regret it? Keith. You're on mute, Keith.
Thanks. I just want to thank everyone for this opportunity to talk about this issue. I'm in a very rainy Paris at the moment and really enjoying this conversation so far. I think I may have been the last person to give a talk at the AGMI while Edita was director, actually. And I just want to emphasize something that's been emphasized before, just a couple points. The AGMI really functioned as not as a mouthpiece of the Armenian state, but as a research institute sponsored by the Armenian state. And so certain other rules apply. And that it's the credible distance that it had from the Armenian state, which permitted it to really be this credible institution on the international stage. I mean, should the standard be what happens in Turkey or what happens in Azerbaijan? No, not for these sorts of things. It really existed beyond the grasp of the state. But here's the problem. Edita Gzoyan was sort of caught in this political space, right? She's an academic. One of her jobs is to escort people when they come and visit the institution. In retrospect, there should have been a protocol officer. There should have been, not her fault, but the state itself should have managed the visit a little bit more than it probably did. And we hopefully this would happen in the future if this happens again. But I'm not even quite sure that are you imagining that she could criticize Pashinyan while Vance was there? That probably wouldn't have been appropriate on all sorts of levels. But surely, as an academic, she does have the basic right to call into question or criticize the way the Armenian state is talking about the past. And I don't see, that shouldn't be something that should be policed by the Armenian state if indeed it wants to present itself as a democracy.
Thank you. Yes, Bedros.
In the past couple of years, there's been many irresponsible statements by Pashinyan's government, like Kocharyan, Antranik Kocharyan and Pashinyan himself, not putting into question the Armenian genocide by saying weird and confusing statements about the Armenian genocide. Sometimes sounds like nihilist to me, soft denialism. And many people approached me saying why the AGMI is not issuing any statement criticizing the government. And when I called AGMI, they told me that they do not interfere in government statements because they are a research institute dedicated solely to research all types of violence that have been inflicted on Armenians in the course of history, whether the Hamidian massacres, whether the Adana massacres, whether the Armenian genocide, or whether the Azerbaijani violence, past and present, including the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, which happened a few years ago. And the key point here is that Pashinyan wants to declare, and he's doing that actually, that Artsakh's page is closed and we're done with that. So any type of research or any type of statements, whether scholarly or non-scholarly, about the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh is considered now as a taboo in Armenia by the government. All right. So I'm very concerned about the future research agenda in the Armenian Genocide Museum-Institute because they have a branch there dedicated to the to the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. So, and I think the current government is going to, if they win the upcoming elections, they're going to look into very critically look at the work that's being done in the Armenian Genocide Museum-Institute as it pertains to the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. So,
thank you. Yes, Armen.
Yes, I agree with all that Bedros has said, and the fact that this is primarily a research institute, and it has that added role of as one said, a protocol that when foreign visitors come, they are taken there. And the two tasks I don't think are necessarily separable, because once you get the government involved in escorting people, you will find that the foreign policy of that government then is the basis upon which you take people there or you don't take people there. I don't think we need to, we should have an institution of that kind. And I think all of this has been heightened by the election. I think that Pashinyan has doubled down on his peace initiative. He's constantly calling for the fact that if he's not reelected, there's going to be more violence. There's going to be an attack by Azerbaijan. This is all part of his strategy. I mean, I had because I was on a Fulbright in the fall in Armenia, I visited the museum and I was talking with the director, with Edita, about whether there was any pressure coming from the Pashinyan administration to the work that the museum is doing. And she said there wasn't. And we're talking about end of November, beginning of December. And I was said, well, I'm glad they're keeping a distance. And then that's why I think in part she was blindsided by this, because she wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary in terms of accompanying high level visitors, government visitors. I mean, we say that Vance was the highest level U.S. visitor. Well, we know that Nancy Pelosi, as Speaker of the House, was also visited the memorial, and that's a very high level, I would say, in a way higher than Vice President, but we can debate that in American politics.
Thank you, Armen. So, as Bedros alluded to, the dismissal of Gzoyan is one event in what has been sort of a developing narrative over the past several years in Armenia in terms of the relationship between the prime minister and his administration and its attitude towards the history of the Armenian genocide, as well as the more recent history of Artsakh. 2 years ago, two commentators wrote that, quote, Pashinyan's 2024 commemoration message seems to mark a sea change in terms of language and rhetoric and the advent of a disturbing self-censorship mode when it comes to naming the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide. Now, those two commentators in this case happen to be Bedros and myself, but I think we stand by what we wrote at the time, and we might view the March 2026 events as establishing a new benchmark. So perhaps we should ask, is this a sea change that is permanent, or is this a sea change that is reversible? If does it depend on who is elected in June, or does it depend on other factors? Is this going to be a steady decline, or is this just going to be a blip on the radar looked at in the long view? I realize you're historians and not prognosticators, but here we are. Elise.
Well, as somebody who's frequently targeted in the United States and academia, and not always for what I'm saying about Armenians, just last week, I was personally targeted, as well as my center, over really actually generally a pushback against any program that's not following the Israeli state narrative and following the IRA definition of anti-Semitism that would include any criticism of Israel being anti-Semitism, which of course it's not. I think that basically Armenia is basically on track with the rest of the world, where there's a kind of repression against academics. And already Simon Marakian has noted that there were two other scholars who have been targeted in Armenia, not only Edita in the Q&A, and we can maybe read that soon, but he wanted to broaden to talk about other Armenian academics that are being repressed. And I would add, globally, we have a repression of academics, or an attempt to silence or intimidate academics, to get them sort of in this mode of anticipatory obedience, to obey laws that have yet to be enacted, or laws that are actually anti-constitutional in the case of the United States. And while I have the floor, I do have to add that in this field of gender and Armenian genocide studies, which Edita is also part of, and very important in this subfield of Armenian genocide studies, we also have the loss of Tamar Sharinian, who was fired for a Facebook post. And we've also had news this weekend from Armenia about harassment of people who make Facebook posts that are critical. So it's academic, and it's also free speech, and it's part of this kind of global turn towards authoritarianism. And we know now that about 75% of the world is living under authoritarianism. So the question is, can Armenia push back against that tide? And I think maybe that's a question we're all thinking of right now.
Thank you. Bedros.
Yeah, I think the Pashinyan's government policies are catering United States policy in the Caucasus and trying to satisfy both neighbors, Azerbaijan and Turkey, in toning down on anything that has to do with the crimes perpetrated by both regimes and their descendants, their ancestors and the descendants, because denial of genocide means continuation of the genocide. And the second thing I think is that, and of course, TRIP is bringing kind of a major, from Pashinyan's perspective, a major economic upheaval for Armenia. So their idea is that we have a lot to benefit, and we're going to benefit more from TRIP than from the Armenian diaspora. So who cares what the Armenian diaspora says from their perspective? And that's why there was an interesting article in one of the Azerbaijani newspapers called "Pashinyan Cuts the Umbilical Cord of the Diaspora." So that's very interesting. that the way in which others view too the policies. But I think overall, as Elise raised the issue, I think Armenia is on the way there's an urbanization of Armenia that's happening now. Urbanization of Armenia.
With an O, not a U.
Yeah, not urbanization, urbanization. Viktor Orban of Hungary, and he's considered to be one of the most populist presidents in around the globe. I mean, Pashinyan himself is a populist, and populism, I don't think it's a good thing. And so to that extent, there is a crackdown on academia. But this is not crackdown on dissent of political policies of the government, kind of regional policy, etc. It's a crackdown on one of the most important events in the course of Armenian history, which is the Armenian Genocide. And it's kind of toning down of the genocide and the idea of keeping the genocide just on the shelves, which means Armenia, as the foreign policy, its foreign policy today is prevention of genocide. And if you go to the recognition page of the foreign ministry, it doesn't say anything about the foreign policy that we are striving that countries recognize the Armenian genocide. No, that's done for them. And they list the countries that have accepted genocide. And this government said clearly that it's not our aim to pursue recognition of the Armenian genocide or pursue Haitadism, meaning Haitad, and pursue any other option, any other demands from our neighbors. We want to live in peace with our neighbors, with our new understanding of what is new Armenia. And their new Armenia is kind of detached from the past. New Armenia is built on a new understanding, whereby these issues would be just shelved, and there should be no discussions, not willingly, but also forcefully bringing people not to raise these issues or not to discuss these issues. It's not that everyone is free to do whatever they want, so there's no freedom. There is a forceful subjugation, I should say, of dissenting voices, be it scholars or priests, clergy, or lay people. Thank you.
It's and Armin, I see your hand, and Keith, it's a peculiar sort of either or, though, where the government might have a policy of no longer pursuing genocide recognition or reparations or restitution in any form, but to then extend that to essentially suppressing discussion in an academic or research context of the subject, or looking askance at it even, and creating a chilling effect is quite a different thing altogether. Armin.
Yes, I wanted to add to your question you raised about is this a blip?
Thank you.
And will it switch back and forth? Well, there's a danger, even if it switches back. We've already attacked and diminished the institutional basis upon which democracy works, because democracy is not just a matter of holding elections every 4 or 5 years. You have to have institutions that can work independently, that are open to diverse opinions and positions. All of that gets diminished when it depends on who's in power at the time, what gets appropriate for discussion and what's inappropriate for discussion. And I think the great irony when Bedros was speaking is that some of this is reflective of even the Soviet system, of the way history was treated under the Soviet Union. And And we know, the dangers of all of that. And we know in Armenia, the whole birth of the memorial was a result of finally a pushback on the whole idea that this history needs to be buried. I mean, in a way, Tsitsanagabert was a creation of an anti-authoritarian view and the attempt to completely bury the Armenian genocide.
Thank you. Keith. Mute.
So thanks, Mark. One thing I think sometimes is I've been getting lost in some of this conversation is that I think the switch is not just a switch to cater to foreign policy needs, but it's a shift within Armenian politics, maybe even Armenian society itself. And
Explain.
you could hear this some of what Bedros was saying. So what is it, really at the heart of this current kerfuffle is not the Armenian genocide. It was discussions of Artsakh, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, those of us who follow Armenia, like, I tried to do a project in collaboration with Armenians to support Artsakhi refugees, and no one wanted to do it. Right? There was this like, let's not even acknowledge that there is such a thing as an Artsakh refugee, that this even happened. And I remember being at the AGMI at times when Karabakh was integrated into the conversation, and on the one hand, how it moved people, how it moved them and angered them and made them upset, and then also how it also made them uncomfortable. And so that acknowledging what has happened in Karabakh, right, by this government is not good for them because they were in charge when Karabakh was lost. And so suppressing any history or any discussion of Karabakh is strategic on their part, perhaps strategic in terms of international relations, but also domestically strategic, right? As is, and this is what I think that Armin's point, and especially about sort of a revanche of Soviet-style history, but this is actually a lot. We see the same thing here with discussions of slavery in national parks and so on. That by removing the critical discourse around the Armenian genocide itself, you cut Armenians off from their past, but also from the diaspora. And these two elements get in the way, right? And I find this is actually very disturbing to me. And when I remember being in Armenia, like a war was just fought. There are tens of thousands of refugees in this country. Where are they? Who's doing anything for them, right? And the disacknowledgement by Armenians, the Armenian state of Karabakh, is of course at odds with the way many Armenians remember the course of events, which ultimately I think is very dangerous to them as well.
Yes, there are tens of thousands of Karabakh refugees in Armenia. Indeed, some of them also ride the subway, apparently, as we saw last week. So, a few days ago, Prime Minister Pashinyan had stated, this is to Keith's point, that this is not just a question of the Armenian genocide, but also of Artsakh. He said, quote, the more we pursue historical injustice, the more we pursue historical justice, the more we will face new historical injustices. I believe we should pursue a just reality, not the restoration of historical justice. This applies to presumably the Armenian genocide, as well as to Artsakh and to any other cases of historical justice or injustice. It's quite an extraordinary thing to hear the head of a state make such a statement. And I'm reminded of the concept that was articulated over a decade ago by the Turkish Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoglu of just memory, which is to say, let's set aside all these things and just That's that word again. And just talk about things that bring us together, and not talk about things that happened in the past. In the famous words of Faulty Towers, don't mention the war. Uh, Bedros.
Oh,
Oh, sorry, Elise. Elise, yes.
Elise,
Then
Elise.
Bedros.
my comment was really quick, but I would also add, if we're going to talk about Turkey, we do have, a new case of Article 301, denigration of Turkishness, being levied against a woman who showed Aurora's sunrise in Diyarbakir. So Article 301 and this denigration of Turkishness charge, it's also a foreign policy. So I find maybe the subtext here we could think about is whether or not we see this kind of obedience to, Article 301 with this sort of reframing of the past, or criminalizing discussion of the past, or doling out punishment for those who speak of the past. In the case of Armenia, it wouldn't be surprising to find that application sort of behind or motivating some of these statements.
Bedros, thank you.
I concur with Elise. And again, I mean, to reiterate what I said, to what extent Pashinyan is catering the desire of the two neighbors, Turkey and Azerbaijan, and to what extent is he doing this on purpose because he believes in it. He might believe in it that connecting anything that deals with historical justice is connected to the previous regimes. So he wants to detach himself from the previous regimes and create a new Armenia as he believes in. But any society that has been victim to genocide, if they approach, if they approach, if they approach with this type of policy, they're actually initiating a crime against memory, killing the memory and killing the legacy and killing the survivors and the descendants of the survivors. So it's a type of soft denialism, I argue. So what is the government going to do in this case? Go to the church, memorial service for the victims, go to the Dzernakapert and put some things, and that's it, As far as I understand, the government is not pursuing anything in its foreign policy. The basic thing is acknowledgement of the genocide by different countries. That's the basic thing. They're not doing that even. They call for prevention of genocide. And prevention of genocide is also connected to prevention of ethnic cleansing, all right? Ethnic cleansing. They couldn't prevent what happened in Artsakh too. So it's interesting. I mean, these are topics for academic discussions. All of us here are academicians, are researchers, scholars. And these are, I think, quote unquote, fascinating topics that needs to be examined more.
Thank
And
you.
mind you, I want to add something here that the research, the amount of research that has been done on the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh has been carried out actually in the Armenian Genocide Museum by the scholars in prominent journals. All right. So that's my concern, is that that's going to be also have its own fate. So
Yes.
thank you.
I think we all can agree that the goal of Armenia as a state having better relations with its neighbors, Azerbaijan and Turkey, is necessary and important. But to again borrow a concept from Timothy Snyder, is what we are seeing here an example of preemptive compliance on the part of the Armenian government regarding these matters of historical crimes, and historical in the sense of also very recent history. It's probably an easy question to answer and doesn't call for an answer, because I think the answer is yes. But if anyone thinks differently, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Well, I've sort of been, as this discussion has come up, not just here, but I've just been racking my brain on an analogous situation, right? Where has the state, where's a state who suffered or descendants of people who suffered genocide or mass atrocity? When has that state ever disacknowledged it or engaged in an active erasure? To some extent, we can kind of think about the way that the communists in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union sort of produced their counter narrative of the atrocities of the Second World War. There's some of that uh, where it was stripped of some of its ethnic dimensions and the political dimension was emphasized, but that doesn't come close. I mean, I'm just, Armin, and I was wondering if you had even thought about this too, whereas like
Well,
this,
the case in the Soviet Union is Stalin's famine in the Ukraine, and that that is considered by many scholars as genocide, and it's not accepted in Russian history at all. That
but it is by Ukrainians, right?
Well, it's and not just Ukrainians,
Mhm.
but I mean, the danger there, and you have that in Rwanda of all places.
Mhm.
You have the government narrative of, I mean, their government narrative, the genocide in Rwanda, doesn't allow for a diversity of views of what happened there. It's very state centric. Here in the Armenian case, we're worrying that the way it's going to be state centric, it's going to be something that is purely in the past, and doesn't have any relevance to Armenia today. And I think that's the narrative they want to have with regard to the Armenian genocide. That it's a historical event that doesn't resonate for Armenians either in Armenia, and we don't care about how it resonates with Armenians in the diaspora. I think that's the way they want to control the narrative. And I think that there are some examples, including Rwanda, that doesn't, that the Kigali authoritarian regime wants their narrative to be the only narrative, which doesn't want to acknowledge that there were multiple victims in the Rwanda genocide.
Thank you, Armin. Elise.
I just wanted to come back to kind of globalize this just a little bit further, just by hitting a few points that I forgot to hit before, which includes thinking about, especially over the last 2 decades in American academia, how there was pressure and also smear campaigns against academics who spoke out against the Iraq War. Now, many people, openly acknowledge that the evidence was weak, and some people say, "Oh, that was a mistake." It's just like a massive crime, but it was just a mistake. So many of us found ourselves on websites and smeared at that time because we were really well aware that there would be no reasonable link between Al Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, for example. But we also had media control around war and embedded journalism, which a lot of this really was innovated in the West Bank and Gaza, where we have embedded journalism controlling narratives, right? And I just want to say that some of that really has found its way into American academia, whether it's through the IRA definition of anti-Semitism or the watchdog groups that were created that time, where they're actually taking on new weight, especially now that we have a Trump administration. So I just want to say that, between that and also, many of us were well aware of what was happening with Donald Quartet and the pressure he was under by Turkish lobbyists when he wrote a book review of Donald Bloxham's book, which covered the Armenian genocide, of course. So there have been attempts to apply what are domestic, policies regarding narratives to the United States and to other places. So I'm not at all surprised that now that Armenia is now embedded in this web of kind of really, I would say, foreign policy interests that are trying to shape academic narrative.
Right. Armenia is part of the world, and it is subject to the same trends and forces as other places. Bedros.
Thank you, Elise. I just remember something when Armin was talking, that eventually this government policy, will not remain a government policy. It's going to be reflected in textbooks for schools and high schools. And, trying to bring a new version of history. You can bring a new version of history, no one is saying Turks are bad or, Azeris are bad, but put the context of what happened put it in the historical context, explain that it was a genocide, then that Turkey still denies the fact that it was genocide. And there needs to be historical justice. There needs to be something out there. All right. Otherwise, we're just leaving it to the pages of history. This is one. The second one has to do with the narrative. All right. So, the Turkey's narrative and Azerbaijani narrative has always been that this issue of recognition of Armenian genocide, or even the coining of the word, using the word genocide by Armenians, is a ploy, quote unquote ploy, used by the Armenian diaspora. So that's the ultimate aim. One of the aims of both Turkey and Azerbaijan is to try to create a rift between Armenia and Armenian diaspora. And to a certain extent, they're being successful, I should say, specifically with this government, who tries to show that any type of criticism by the Armenian diaspora is serving other aims. Anyone who opposes the government policies are a Russian agent. I don't know who was that. Some other Azerbaijan, Turkey, or even other countries presenting, for example, ANCA as a Russian agent. This is the amazing joke. I've never heard a joke like that. ANCA being a Russian agent. Since when? I don't know. But it's a fallacy, of course. So anyone who criticizes the government and its policy becomes a Russian agent. And this prevents an honest academic critical discussion of government's policy. So that's the two things I wanted to add.
Thank you, Bedros. One other thing before we open it up to the audience questions. This an issue that all of us here, I think, have been involved in to some degree over the years is the point of American recognition or non-recognition of the Armenian genocide. Over the past decade, we've seen congressional recognition of the Armenian genocide, then presidential recognition of the Armenian genocide, followed by presidential unrecognition of the Armenian genocide. If it's a fact that Armenia is pivoting or trying to pivot more towards the West, and if America is ratcheting up its involvement in the region, how much does it matter then if America does or does not officially recognize the Armenian genocide? If America took a clear position on the Armenian genocide, could it encourage, as counterfactual as this might sound, encourage the Armenian government to take a stronger stand on the issue? Yes, Bedros.
The irony in all of this is that America did acknowledge the Armenian genocide under Biden, yet the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh took place. What's the use of a country recognizing the Armenian genocide and then not even criticizing, not even putting pressure on the perpetrator group in order to take measures to protect civilians? All right. And of course, the recognition of the Armenian genocide was not done solely based on American foreign policies. Some people tend to believe it was decades of Armenian efforts, the Armenian National Committee of America, Armenian Assembly, or other organizations who worked tirelessly over decades in order to bring awareness of the Armenian genocide. The idea is to prevent. Recognition is aimed to prevent such events as the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. So what's the use, I would say?
So yeah, let me be devil's advocate then. If I'm in Armenia, you say, great, America recognized the Armenian genocide, and it didn't lift a finger to stop what was happening in Artsakh. Why are we wasting our time talking about genocide recognition then? Keith is going to answer this question, I'm sure, or maybe he's going to talk about something else.
So I tend to be skeptical of the value of these recognitions only insofar as when countries say they won't recognize it, then it becomes more of an issue, right? That's the politics around that are important. I think in the U.S. And frankly, I can remember when Biden recognized Armenian genocide. My heart skipped a beat. My kids were at Camp Peru with me. They were really happy. So it does have a value, and recognition, acknowledgement, being seen. These things are important, right? But what and hopefully maybe we can steer some of this in the conversation here as we integrate the audience, which is what measures can and should be taken globally and in the West in particular to actually support Armenians who want to continue to study the Armenian genocide, who want to pursue, who want to promote and protect academic freedom and academic independence. What are some of the measures and statements and so on that concrete actions we can take? Because I think it's so important for us to always remember and recognize it wasn't U.S. recognition of the Armenian genocide that shifted American academia away from the Turkish denialism. It was American, Turkish, and Armenian academics who shifted it away, right? And so this is really, I think, a critical moment for academics in the diaspora to focus their energies to support our colleagues in Armenia, right? And I mean, I just want to say that the Middle East Studies Association is going to issue a letter in the coming days on behalf of Edita, which really make it very clear that this was a violation of academic freedom, but also, and I think this is important. I mean, three-fourths of us here work at state institutions, right? And we're all actually we are conceivably vulnerable, right? If we were in Arkansas right now, people are losing their jobs because of statements about Palestine. Um, UCLA made in their consent decree with the federal government, have accepted the EHRA definition of anti-Semitism. You could imagine that this could is coming back to haunt many of us. But I think we're also in a very strong position to add our voices of support and refuge and scholarly communication to this problem. So I really hope that we could shift that conversation away from I think things that we probably are not going to be able to do much about until after the elections, perhaps, and even then, probably not, to ways that we can try to support colleagues and really, I'll just be frank. This is one of my great fears, is that Armenia will go back to being kind of a black hole in terms of the study of the Armenian genocide. And one of the great things that Edita and her team did was in a very short period of time, really integrate Armenia into global trends in Armenian genocide studies, publishing in real journals, being at a level where collaborations, like the collaborations that Elise and Bedros are doing with people at the Institute, um, you know, I always felt like, this is a place where we could share ideas in a really open and collegial way. And Armenia moving back into this sort of black hole really would be, I think, a terrible blow, akin to some of the blows that we're seeing, for example, with the destruction of the Armenian community of Syria and the stress on the Armenian community in Lebanon as well.
Elise, had I seen your hand
Yeah.
or it's gone?
I'll try to be very quick, but I just wanted to say, related to what Keith was saying, number one, we have so many collaborations. We just received a grant last year from the Republic of Armenia for a collaboration to bring actually these scholars to America for a tour that was supposed to happen in September. That's actually now up in the air. And it was to actually fulfill a law that actually mandated that more scholars, put themselves out there, publish in top journals to increase the scientific and humanities and social science research profile of Armenian academics. So that kind of professional endeavor is now endangered. But I would agree with Keith that all of the scholars at the Institute are now placing their work in our top journals, and it has been incredible work, and it's happened under Edita's watch. And the second part, this is to academics who might be here today. In terms of academic freedom, and this is from the AUP guidelines regarding our professional ethics, paragraph 5. Professors have a particular obligation to promote conditions of free inquiry and to further public understanding of academic freedom. This is our obligation as academics. And I say this is a professional obligation that many of our colleagues are not fulfilling. And I'm very thankful for everyone who has rallied, who has signed, who is doing everything they can to help our colleagues. But what I have seen over the last years is a lot of academics self-censoring, refusing to critique some of the mishaps, I would say, in Yerevan, and the kind of abuse of power that we see here. This is our job, and where I'm not calling for very vulnerable people to do this work, but I'm saying people who are not vulnerable should definitely be engaged, because honestly, in this age, and we see it here in the United States, being a sycophant is not actually being on the side of democracy. You're actually working for the opposite. So, please reconsider your position.
Thank you. And while, I don't want to promote illusions that we're changing the world in what we're doing here today, I do want to say that I have received emails from people over the past couple of weeks in Armenia at other institutions who have seen the statement, for example, of which this current group were signatories, along with a number of our colleagues. The statement issued by NAASR, the statement issued by the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and others. And while they are not changing the realities, perhaps, of what's happening on the ground, it does mean something to these folks at institutions that they are seen and that we are aware and that we are showing support. And at a bare minimum, that is something of importance. Bedros.
Mark, I did some interviews with Armenian news networks, and one of the questions came up on this issue, actually. Did you think that your letter was going to change anything, change Pashinyan's decision to return Dr. Gzoyan to her position? I said no, because we know how our the Prime Minister thinks, and but the aim is to raise awareness that actions have consequences, that the international community of genocide scholars, not only Armenian, and that's the emphasis here, that non-Armenian genocide scholars also were signatories of this statement, are aware of what's happening. And if we don't do this, we wouldn't have done our job. All right, at least in the face of history, or for the pages of history, that we did take this action. But this action is not going to end with this action. I think we are monitoring what's happening with the Armenian Genocide Museum in Yerevan. We're monitoring the freedom of speech in Armenia, and we are concerned. We are concerned scholars who work on similar topics that our colleagues work within the Armenian Genocide Museum, and we will continue. It doesn't end with the statement.
Thank you. There have been a couple of questions from the audience about the specific title of the book edited by Ara Katibian. I posted that and the names of the other books that were distributed to Vice President Vance in the chat. That information is also in the NAASR statement, which is on our website. It's also pointed out by one of the audience members that in the preface to the Katibian book, which is indeed a book of U.S. press coverage of violence against Armenians in the Transcaucasus in the early 20th century, there is language and there are portions of the preface that specifically link that violence to the violence that was then happening against Armenians in Artsakh. This is, I would say, neither controversial nor surprising. Actually, it's perfectly logical and natural. But perhaps that was the problem. I don't know. we have a question here, as previously been mentioned from Simon Mahatkian. Should we broaden the question to ask whether academic freedom of expression is under pressure in Armenia more generally, and if so, whether stakeholders in Armenian studies have a responsibility to push back? Specifically, he raises this because in December, yes, there were reports of state harassment targeting two linguists who had provided expert testimony in support of a detained opposition leader. This was really quite a strange and extraordinary case, and it's true, it drew relatively little protest. So to the larger issue Simon raises, yeah, is this a larger problem in Armenia of academic freedom, and are there other institutions or individuals facing this kind of pressure that we're aware of? And again, to Bedros's point and Keith's point, what is to be done?
Let me just jump in because I mentioned this in the beginning of my comments about how Armenia's higher education is primarily state institutions, and there is an effort on the part of, and many of you are aware of it, of a greater centralization of academia with the creation of this academic city. And the money that will flow in creating that that academic city, I think will be used as leverage to make sure that the focus will be on those things that this government perceives as part of their agenda. I mean, I think it won't be as explicit as, firing academics, but I think there is the danger there of greater centralization, and it's already true that all the state universities, are dependent almost 100% on state funding and the rectors of those. So I think this idea of centralizing higher education and getting everybody under the same roof is a precursor for possible precursor. I won't predict the future of a diminishing of academic freedom that Elise was emphasizing.
Thank you, Armen.
I'd like to add two words to what Armen raised now, is that we know about this large project of the academic city, and if this academic city is going to pursue policies of the government, then we should call it non-academic city. I think that would be a good title.
Another question, thank you, is what are the risks to academic freedom, historical memory, and institutional integrity when certain aspects of a nation's history are treated as politically sensitive or off limits? A profound question. Keith.
So that's a question that we're dealing with in the United States right now as well, right? Which is, how do we portray elements of our own collective past that may not put certain, heroic figures of the past in a good light. This is especially about the treatment of indigenous people, history of enslavement, the incarceration of the Japanese during the Second World War, all of which, are about atrocity and genocide and slavery and massive human rights abuse, right? And so, my argument has always been that a great nation can acknowledge all elements of its past. It should never be afraid to do so because it builds and strengthens only weak states are afraid of their own history. And actually, Armenia is a weak state, and its history can get in the way. And we're seeing how that history is being perceived as an obstacle by the current government, right? So I think one of our mandates, one of our goals is to try to help others understand how histories of difficult topics can be dealt with effectively and not become a stumbling block to history. Now, here's something I think we have to acknowledge, right? which is that one of the ways, for example, that Israel beats up on Palestinian education is they're saying, oh, Palestinian education is all about training young Palestinians to hate Israel because they put in an accurate account of the foundation of the state of Israel in their textbooks. Same with Korea and Japan. Japan beats up on Korea all the time because the Koreans talk about the Japanese occupation and the Japanese atrocities in their textbooks, and the Japanese say that this is something they're using to bring about hatred of the other. So, will Armenians be in a position where they have to eviscerate their own past in order to meet what will probably be a series of moving goalposts, right? I do not believe for a second that there's a textbook or a curriculum or any sort of denial position that Armenia could ever take that will actually satisfy Turkey or Azerbaijan, right? Because they'll keep changing it, right? So that's, but this is something, again, that just really concerns me, is that this is being used, I think, as a way to disconnect Armenia from its diaspora.
Indeed.
And that's a that the I think the challenge for the diaspora is to make its case why that is undermining the value that diaspora can play in the future of Armenia. And I don't know if that case has actually ever been really effectively made by the diaspora, frankly. But that's the point. And so I don't think that we should, that's again why I want this discussion also needs to be pinned not just on Armenian foreign policy, but something else is happening within the Armenian state that is making it want to forget Karabakh and to minimize the genocide. Something is happening right now.
Keith, you raised the case of indigenous genocides and slavery. I frankly don't see the leadership of the native indigenous people saying, let's minimize the past. I don't see the African American leadership saying, let's not talk about slavery, right? It's the governing regime that's saying that. In the case of Armenia, it's different. Who is the governing element on Armenia? It's the Armenian government. So that's a major difference, I think.
Elise.
I only had one quick insertion, was that in last week there was the vote at the UN General Assembly on slavery as the greatest crime against humanity, and there were 3 votes against. It was the United States, Israel, and Argentina, but there were also 52 abstentions, and I'm sure there would be arguments, and I think many of them had to do with legal ramifications of it, an admission of some kind of wrongdoing, criminal wrongdoing. But I mean, of course, these are things that various states, and I'm comparing apples and oranges here, but I think the struggle to actually grapple with the past is something that's happening with these issues, regardless of where you're located. But I do think the impact on education that we're seeing in the United States and in Armenia are incredibly alarming. And one of the more recent models I would also direct us to think about is the purging of Turkish academics after the 2016 failed coup in Turkey, which, I mean, we had academics committing suicide when they lost their livelihood or going into exile, and many of them are our friends and colleagues. And so ruined lives and livelihoods, people who can't travel to see family. This is the type of devastation, like the worst form of authoritarianism on education, can wreak on people. So I just wanted to point out these 2 examples.
Thank you. Yes, and like Bedros, I wanted to take up the irony of what you were saying, Keith, that in the discussions here in the United States, it's a question of the United States being reluctant to discuss some of its own crimes or actions, whereas this is a reluctance to take up the actions of others. But I do think there are, while the majority voices, Bedros, in this country speaking on behalf of minorities, African Americans or Native Americans, do not engage in this behavior. There are minority voices within those minorities that perhaps similarly want to let, quote unquote, the past be the past and just move on and forget about these unfortunate parts of the earlier history, which in the end tends to advance the interests of the people who committed the crimes in the first place, I think. There's a question here. Was the reason for the firing specified as being the book on Artsakh by the Pashinyan government? Indeed. Prime Minister Pashinyan, as I mentioned in the introduction, stated, quote, I considered giving a book about Artsakh to Vance to be a provocative act that goes against the government's policy. So whether the book was or was not actually about Artsakh, it was that it was perceived as such by the prime minister that was the unforgivable action here. Question: in Armenia today, it is a popular mentality to leave the past in the past as their security is the most important thing. And that is why they see the recognition of the genocide as a burden. This may or may not be a widespread view in Armenia. I don't know, but I put it to the group. Is this an attitude, and do we need to not take that into consideration, Keith?
So Tallene makes a point later on in the questions where this could be actually a traditionalist view, which I thought was a very interesting point to make, which is if we think about some sort of earlier, that demands to acknowledge the Armenian genocide or to write about it or build a history of it is actually a phenomenon that was uneven in its history, where immediately afterwards there may have been interest, but then interest waned, right? And I mean, we talk about this, a microcosmic kind of example is, we were talking about the Japanese American internment. Japanese American internment was actually amongst the Japanese American community, not something that was talked about for a long time,
Yeah.
right? So there are examples of this self-censorship, but not necessarily by state authorities. I mean, this is why I keep racking my brain to see if there's some other example of this. But we we talk about the terror of history, right? This idea that, if history becomes such a burden on a community that it paralyzes them and doesn't allow them to move forward that you can't, that's unacceptable. It's an unethical position to be so burdened by history that it becomes a paralytic. And I think but that's not that's not what's being talked about here at all. This is about a narrow political agenda by a current administration, right? And that other question about the burden of the genocide on, the Armenian nation, right? That's a good question to ask, but that's not what's being talked about here.
Thank you. Bedros.
To answer the question, I haven't seen any poll or polls
Right.
that demonstrate that which percentage of the Armenian population is against or for recognition of the Armenian genocide as part of a national demand or foreign policy. But I think regardless of polls, if the government has decided, and this government have decided whatever they're going to pursue, they're going to pursue, So I don't think that the opinion of the masses of the population matters here.
Nor should it necessarily matter for the academic world to do its work, frankly. Armen.
Yeah, just a footnote to that. I'm looking forward to being in Yerevan on April 24th and participating in the march up to the memorial. And I'm curious how what has happened at the Genocide Museum-Institute will be part of the discussion with people there on the ground. As we know, every April 24th, hundreds of thousands of Armenians go up there. And, to say that it's not a particular burning issue or an issue for Armenians would then be belied by the fact that 1 million Armenians tend to visit the memorial on that date. So I don't think you would need to take a poll on that. I think it's the evidence is there in many ways. But whether people realize what's happening with regard to the Museum Institute itself, that's a related, but it might be a different issue.
Bedros, go ahead.
Just quickly to add to Armin's point here, a good portion of Armenians, whether in the diaspora or within Armenia, for them, the Armenian Genocide Museum is Armenian Genocide Museum, the Eternal Fire and the museum. And they don't know how much serious work is being done by the scientific group within the Armenian Genocide Museum. All right. There are 15, 16 or more, 20 or I don't know, 30 serious scholars who are day and night working, producing not only Armenian articles or books, but also in English and other languages within important international journals. So, and this began actually in the past 5 years to gain a ground. And once it began to gain ground, and then we see this, I don't want to speak about conspiracies, but then we see this sudden detachment, sudden forceful removal of Dr. Edita Gzoyan. So,
Speaking of conspiracies, and I'm turning to you, Bedros, but others as well, because I know you've written about this. There's a lot of concern about the physical state of the genocide memorial. Is there any connection between the construction, reconstruction work that's happening there and this other situation? And is this something we should be worried about?
When the construction work was taking place, there was a lot of pressure on Dr. Edita Gzoyan and the staff from journalists, from opposition figures, from opposition activists, and actually wrote a lengthy article in the newspaper about the things that needed to be done at the Armenian Genocide Museum. This is even prior to Pashinyan government, prior to the so-called revolution, prior to everything else, that the Armenian Genocide Museum suffered from structural problems. Water was leaking in, rain was leaking in. There needs to be some changes, and because the structure itself is how many since 1965, so there needed to be done immediate structural things, changes. And when that began with the government expected that the director of the Armenian Genocide Museum should be responsible for that. Well, the Armenian Genocide Museum director is not a contractor, does not understand from, as usually any one of us here, does not understand from what needs to be done in terms of concrete, in terms of, how to build, how to destroy it, etc. So the whole idea began actually that the removal of Dr. Edita Gzoyan from her position was because of her quote unquote mismanagement of the structure of the construction of the build of the memorial. All right, and that was in a way a kind way, quote unquote, kind way of removing her without explaining what was the real reason. And then Pashinyan said openly that that's why I removed her, because of G. Vance and the book that was given to G. Vance. And these books are actually part of protocol that's being given for years, if not decades, to different diplomats that come and visit the Armenian Genocide Museum. What was unique about this, I think, because it was G. Vance and he was on his route to Baku. So,
Armen.
Just adding to what Bedros said, when I visited the Museum Institute and spoke with Dr. Gzoyan in December, she was pointing out that they're coming to the conclusion of the renovation and much of the work has already been accomplished. And she was sort of very proud of the fact that despite all the criticism and the blaming, the work actually took place, and it will solve the problem. So I think it was used as a political sort of batting around criticism, not just of the prior director, but also continuing to shed sort of a bad light on the museum itself. But I think it's not, as Bedros said, Pashinyan's motivation was nothing to do with that. And in terms of past, and I'm not talking about the museum itself, but I'm talking about how corruption was endemic in Armenia on these sorts of projects. In the past, you can see people always thinking of, someone has done this and profited from it, but that was not the case with the Museum-Institute and the memorial.
There's a question about whether Vice President Vance received the books after all, and what will be the fate of those books. He did receive the books. I don't know what the fate of them is. He may be reading them right now, for all I know. I'm not sure, but he did receive them. So there are a number of questions about to Keith's point about the diaspora and what's happening in Armenia, just to broad brush this. First of all, is there any reason to think that the diaspora writ large in all capital letters, assuming we all think the same way, which we don't, should the diaspora necessarily be on the same page as the government of Armenia on this issue or other issues, and vice versa? Is there should it be surprising or problematic or controversial that there are differences of opinion on how to deal with these issues of history and current events between diaspora and individuals or groups and the government of Armenia? Isn't this normal, Bedros?
First of all, I would call it diasporas, not diaspora, because there isn't single diaspora, and Armenian diasporas are multi-layered. They're different, representing different regions around the globe, having different views. But most of them are actually descendants of the survivors of the Armenian genocide. Most of them. There used to be diasporas prior to the Armenian genocide. And the Armenian diaspora actually is not intervening in criticizing the government's subsidies given to specific X or Y person to build apartment buildings in Yerevan, destroying Yerevan's historic image. But it's criticizing one of the most important issues of collective memory that connects Armenian diasporas with Armenia. Armenians in Armenia also are descendants. Hundreds of thousands of them are descendants of the Armenian genocide. Hundreds of thousands went to Armenia as refugees, as all of you know. So if you're going to deny Armenian diasporas of having a say in the core issue that is considered one of the core issues component of Armenian identity in the modern period, which is the Armenian genocide, then I think you are cutting your two legs of the body or one leg of the body. I don't know how to present it, just to show the severity of the issue.
Could I just quickly add something?
Please.
Which say we're not alone. I've been bringing in this parallel a lot, but I mean, Israel also has tensions with members of the Jewish diaspora who have been targeted because they're not touting, the party line out of Tel Aviv. So I would just say that these kinds of tensions, I think, are natural within diasporas. And of course, we don't all agree. We even vote differently in the United States, for those of us who live here. But I would say with regard to academics, we too have our tensions. And they're, years ago, many of the people who helped train me were attacked viciously, by academics in Yerevan. However, we've been working together towards, building relations, collaborations, co-authorship and cooperation, which, Bedros is co-editing a volume with Edita that I'm participating in as well. And all of this, I think, is a kind of diplomatic work that's unofficial. It's not state sanctioned, but it's really about people coming together and thinking together. And I think that also does a certain work to minimize the tensions that happen between states and diasporas.
Thank you. Another audience member points out, and I had seen this news item yesterday as well, that there is a documentary film on the Artsakh war that is being prohibited from being broadcast in Armenia. I don't know the particulars of or the rationalization for this, or if one has been offered. But
I think this is Dikram Baskevician's.
thank you. Yes, that's correct. And has a reason been articulated about why this cannot be shown, or is it simply, once again, that this is contrary to Armenia's foreign policy?
Well, no reason has been given aside from the fact that the public television has underwritten the financing of the film, and they say it's their property, so they should control its broadcast. And the court ruling was in their favor, and it also seemed to restrict any public showing, which is, I think, much more dangerous. But the director said he's going to show it in private, and I guess what's the difference between private and public here?
Well, this is no publicity is bad publicity, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
People really want to see the film now.
Yeah.
Exactly. In the interest of bringing this in under 90 minutes, then let me ask if there are any final words from any of you four.
I think we're looking at an important moment in the relationship between the pursuit of the history of the Armenian genocide in Armenia and the relationship between that pursuit and the international effort to do the same, right? So we have to be very clear about that, is that is what's at stake at the moment. And if I think that we can kind of get lost in thinking about this only in terms of the upcoming elections, but I think that there's a different process, a much deeper process is unfolding in Armenia right now, for which this is just one element of a much larger shift towards popular authoritarianism. So my argument is, quite frankly, that if the diaspora wants to help, this is one area where it can. And I think that Marx asked, the question is, should the diaspora engage itself in anything? I think Bedros' point is right. If it's going to engage in anything, it should be this, right? Is that this is part of the shared history. This explains why there's Armenians in Armenia and Armenians in California. And so I think that this is also something, I hate to say it, put it this way, supporting academic inquiry is not that expensive. So it's like, we're not talking about vast sums of money here, but money well spent and put towards best use. Again, I just want to thank everyone real quick for this. This was really important. It was just devastating for those of us who were in Armenia when this was happening. And I just want to also share again that the Middle East Studies Association, which tends not to engage in support for Armenian issues, will be issuing a letter on behalf of Edita in the coming days.
I want to reiterate what Keith said is what we can do as scholars is collaborate with our colleagues in Armenia. Our book with Edita Gzoyan called The Concentration Camps of the Armenian Genocide is coming out in August by Bloomsbury Press. We put 2 years on this book. It's a very difficult book to read, very difficult topic to deal with, and it took us a lot of time and energy and emotion. And we didn't have funding from outside. When I approached an Armenian organization to fund the book, we were denied funding, actually. Armenian organization, I don't want to give names here. So it shows you that the government in Armenia has the upper hand. They can fund projects that would promote their policy. But the individual scholars within Armenia, they don't have an upper hand. sometimes funding from, and NAASR's grant is Vartan grant and NAASR's grant, Knights of Vartan and NAASR's grant have been very helpful to that extent. And being an editor of a series with IB Torres, we've been able to use actually NAASR's grant to our projects. So if anyone is interested to support scholars that would like to publish in English in university presses or trademark presses or anything, and we need funding for that in order to promote the work of the Armenian scholars who deal with Armenian genocide. And the latest project that we finalized actually was Professor Harutyun Marutyan's book titled Commemorating the Armenian Genocide, which was partially funded, I should say, by NAASR grant. So that's what we're trying to do, bits and pieces, but it's not enough. I mean, we need serious funding if we want to expand the field within Armenia and strengthen the connection of Armenian historians or non-Armenian historians with Armenian scholars of genocide or mass violence. So
it is serious funding, but Keith's point is a fair one. It's serious money, but compared to other forms of serious money, it's still relatively cheap. And the money goes a long way. And I appreciate the shout out to NAASR Knights of Vartan for our grant issuing, which are not vast sums of money being given to scholars, but they do make a difference in helping these scholars get the work published and out there, and that work then has an impact. So thank you, Armen.
I just want to finish by reiterating what I said in the beginning, and I actually have the quote from Timothy Snyder: "To abandon facts is to abandon freedom." And I think abandoning facts is abandoning the history, the truth of the history. And I think that's a dangerous road to be on. And this is one of the lessons we should learn from what happened at the Genocide Museum-Institute.
Thank you. Elise.
I would just say, there's a reason why autocrats attack academia. And I know that American academia has lost sight of this as it's neoliberalized, as it's become a for-profit endeavor. But scholarly work is at the heart of democracy. It is at the heart of all of the issues that entails: freedom of speech and academic freedom. And so we can't lose sight of that. And I would also say, I'm going to take Keith up on his offer, and we all here have collaborated on the statement, but making the case as to why the study of the Armenian genocide matters, not just to the diaspora and not just to Armenia, but to the world. And I say this as international law, international norms have withered. What wasn't said today, Pashinyan joined the Board of Peace to administer Gaza. That wasn't said. I don't know that we know this, but he sits next to Viktor Orban. He sits next to Trump and Netanyahu on that board. So I think that really matters, and we have to keep reiterating why it is that the Armenian genocide matters to international law. Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, all panelists. Thank you, all audience members. Thank you, especially those of you who hung in for the entire 90 minutes. Thank you to the Society for Armenian Studies and the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation for supporting contemporary issues programs. And the whole thing is watchable on YouTube. So if you're not watching now, you're not going to hear me say this, but you can go back and watch it on YouTube later. I'm sure this isn't the last word on this subject.